Well, we're here in the Bode Museum in Berlin, and we're representatives of three different religious traditions. I'm a Christian priest. My name's Ben Quash, and I teach Christian theology at King's College in London. And I'd love you to introduce yourselves as well, because you're native to this city, and I'm the visitor. So.
My name is Mira Zivas. I'm a junior professor of Islamic theology at Humboldt University.
And I am Rabbi Geza Ederberg, just from across the street. That's my synagogue, the Oranienburger Straße Synagogue, and I'm happy to be here.
The Bode Museum is full of objects, many of them with a religious history, a religious purpose originally. And what we wanted to do was to meet together around a couple of these objects and explore the figures in them in cases where those figures are shared between our three traditions. Partly to ask, who are these people for us? And how are they similar in our three traditions, but also maybe how are they understood and responded to differently? And so for this film, we're looking at the figure of Abraham, and our traditions of Judaism and Islam and Christianity are often described as Abrahamic religions because we all share this figure, and he's sometimes described as almost this point of origin in some ways of our three traditions. So here we have him, and he's carved in ivory, in this object that's made of ivory, which dates from around 400 CE, so it's a very early object. And the object is a pyx. It's a Christian object in this case, and a pyx was something that was used to store the bread that had been blessed and consecrated in the Christian Eucharist or Mass or Holy Communion service, so as to become the place where the presence of Christ was believed to be. And in that bread and in the wine, Christ was distributed to the people who gathered to worship at the Christian altar. So it's a holy vessel. I wonder, first of all, how you both respond to this, and what episode, what moment we might be looking at. Geza, I wonder if you want to tell us what you think's going on here.
So, I mean, it's the very, very central episode, I think, for all the three religions and for all of us also. Abraham was holding a knife and holding on to his son Isaac. And we see just above, we see the finger of God pointing at Abraham, and there is a little ram there standing, and somebody who could be an angel also looking into the scene. It's this very iconic picture of, as we call it in Judaism, the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, because for us it's very crucial that there was no sacrifice, right? So Abraham wakes up one morning and hears God telling him that he should go and sacrifice his son. And then they walk up to the mountain, which is supposed to be the mountain where the temple will be built later. And as he's lifting the sword, there comes a voice of God or of God's messengers saying, do not sacrifice your son. And then he finds the ram entangled in a bush nearby, and he takes the ram and puts the ram instead of his son on the altar and sacrifices the animal instead of his son.
That's a lovely summary of the story as in the Hebrew Bible and in what Christians call the Old Testament. We share this story. We might interpret it differently, but we share this story. The elements are all the same. The text is the same. It's a little bit different, I guess, in the Quran, isn't it, Mira?
I mean, the first thing which I'd like to say as a Muslim theologian is that this object is older than the Quran itself. So it's a very nice thing to illustrate that there was some kind of background when the Quran was revealed in the 7th century on the Arabian Peninsula. And ideas about Abraham and the story of Abraham and the sacrifice or not sacrifice of his son was one of these ideas that was around. And therefore the Quran in several places talks about the story, alludes to it. Abraham is in one surah called Ibrahim alladhi waffa, Abraham who held his trust. And this is most certainly an allusion to this scene. And I would say there are not so many differences, but some perhaps significant differences. There's no binding in the binding of Abraham's son, because in the Quranic version of the story, Abraham has a vision in his dream and then talks to his son about it and tells him, I have seen in my dream that I will sacrifice you. What do you think? And
Seems fair enough to ask his opinion.
yeah, and his son says, if God wills, I will be patient. So he accepts his fate, and therefore there is no binding. So he deliberately offers himself as a sacrifice. And perhaps the second significant difference is a difference in the reception of the story in the later Islamic tradition, because there has been a great deal of disagreement about the question which son of Abram was actually the son to be sacrificed. And it's very interesting to see that the Quran leaves it open. So the name is not mentioned.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But after the story, Isaac is mentioned. So now you can do two things. You can say, well, it's afterwards, so it must be the other son. Or you can say, yeah, in this case, Isaac is mentioned because the story was about him. And I would say a minority opinion says it was Isaac, and the majority says, no, it was about Ishmael, so Ismail in the Islamic tradition.
We have the same discussions on what there is a verse when God speaks to Abraham. He says, Kach et bincha et yechidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzchak. Now there's a principle in the Jewish exegesis, so to speak, that the Bible does not say anything in vain. There are no superfluous things in the Bible. So the Midrashim, the later explanations and commentaries explain that this was actually a dialogue between God and Abraham. So God says, take your son, and Abraham goes, I have two. Your only one, well, this one is the only one for his mother, Sarah, and this one is the only one for his mother, Hagar. Whom you love, I love them both equally. Et Yitzchak, and then with the name, it suddenly gets, okay, now I know whom I have to take. And then the Midrash says that Ishmael went along, and only a couple of, 100 meters before they really ascend to the top of the mountain, he stays back, and Yitzchak walks together with his father.
I love the fact that you can't quite tell if this Isaac is bound or not, because his hands seem to be behind his back. So they could be tied, but you can't quite tell, which leaves that interesting possibility. But as you say, Geza, it's called the binding in Jewish tradition, and in Christian tradition, it's known as the sacrifice, and even the title here on the label in the Border Museum says Abraham's Opfer, Abraham's sacrifice. And yet, paradoxically, it isn't. If anything is sacrificed, it's sacrifice itself. But that doesn't take away one very disturbing element of the story, which is that he's willing to do it. And certainly Christian tradition celebrates Abraham's obedience, absolute obedience, so that he'll do this unthinkable thing without apparently questioning, which in a way the Quran seems to mitigate by involving Isaac somehow in the decision. But I wonder whether that disturbing element has been a topic for you.
We also have as they are walking, also Yitzchak starts asking, we have the firewood, we have the kindling, we have everything, but where is the sacrifice? And Abraham answers, well, God will find the sacrifice, my son. Now you can argue about the comma in that sentence, right? The sacrifice, my son, or is it... So I think that's like writing into the story already that the Jewish tradition expects Abraham not to act on God's command.
The fact that the Eucharistic bread, as I was saying, is kept here, I think reinforces what's a typological reading in Christianity of this, which is to say there's a sort of matching of an event in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and an event in the New Testament, and one is seen as a foreshadowing of the other. And it's the sacrifice of Christ, remembered in some ways, reenacted at the Christian altar in the Eucharist, which seems to match itself up with this story. And Jesus is sometimes compared with Isaac. Jesus is the beloved son of his heavenly Father, and is offered by his father in that sense. But the typology doesn't quite work because Isaac isn't sacrificed and Jesus is. So you can see why this would make sense on a pyx, but there's also a dissonance, there's also a mismatch, between the two stories.
What I really was not aware of, that there is an element of remembrance even in the Christian tradition there, because for us the entire scene relates to the Yom HaZikaron, to the Day of Remembrance, which is the day of the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, when this story, it's crucial that this story is read, and we are remembering how God saved Yitzchak in that moment. And we do even more, if I may. I brought something. Kind of the same material. I mean, this is an elephant, right? And this is only a ram's horn, but I think it fits pretty well.
Bone-like quality
yes,
to both of them,
yes.
isn't there?
Every synagogue has that, and many people have it also at home. It's called a shofar, and it's really the, how does it go? Like this, I suppose? Because the ram was really entangled in the bush with his horns, so he needs these long horns to be kept there. And we blow into it, and it makes this really weird sound, on Rosh Hashanah 100 times, if you through the day, to remember us about, following God's words on the one hand, but even more important, to remind God. So it's not only us remembering, but God, who should remember that he had mercy and the sacrifice did not happen. Rosh Hashanah is also followed by 10 days later by the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and it's this period of, looking into what has gone wrong, what you have done wrong during the year, and God has to remember to be merciful and forgiving. And that's the object.
Can you blow it for us?
I can try.
This is, we think, perhaps a first in the Border Museum.
Let's see.
Wow.
Yeah, and you hear this sounding in the synagogue, and what I like about us usually, the kids are running around because the service is very long, so we call them in just beforehand, and then you have the little ones, and some of them really, they go like, wow. Yeah. And the babies start maybe crying because it's so loud and surprising in terms of sound, so it really makes it very tangible, right?
So what do we think in our three traditions Abraham is meant to teach us? What virtues, if any, does he embody above all? Mira, what would you say to that?
I would first like to add two things. The first one, you talked about typological readings. One of the reasons why Abraham is very important in the Islamic tradition is the way the Prophet Muhammad, by rereading some of the stories of the biblical tradition, which form part of the Quran, like this story, he becomes able to understand his own role as a prophet. And Abraham is significant in many ways, and one of the ways is the fact that he only worships one God, and he doesn't obey the people of his family who worship more than one God, and that's exactly something that Muhammad, the prophet, does as well. And of course, the second thing is the obedience to God, being faithful, being loyal to the one God. And in that way, I would say Abraham is perhaps a precursor to Muhammad. And that's mentioned many times in the Quran. You just talked, Gisa, about the way how Jews today remember the story of Abraham. And I think that's also an element of the story that connects the faiths, because you said the story is remembered during the Eucharist, that's the right word?
Yes.
And you said it's remembered at Rosh Hashanah. For Muslims, it's remembered on Eid al-Adha. Eid al-Adha is the most important holiday in Islam, and it's the holiday of the sacrifice, which means that Muslims all around the world, all over the world, they slaughter animals, eat part of it, and donate most parts of it to poor people. At the same time, the pilgrims in Mecca who do the annual Hajj, so the pilgrimage to Mecca, they also sacrifice animals in Mecca as the final point of the pilgrimage. And on the same day, when they sacrifice the animals, they do the symbolical stoning of Satan. So they throw stones against columns, and what they do is they resist temptation, remembering how Abraham resisted temptation not to fulfill the command to sacrifice his son. So there's this idea that Abraham had to resist, and at the end he was obedient, but nevertheless God rescued his son, and he didn't have to sacrifice him.
It makes it pretty central.
Yeah, it's interesting because we also throw something on Rosh Hashanah, and actually it's really just here across. If we look out of the window, that's where we stand. We walk from the synagogue, standing in front of the water, looking at the Bode Museum, which I think is really nice. We look into our pockets if we have leftover crumbs and a little bit of dirt, and with that we throw all our sins into the water. We stand there and I say, take your time, think about what you want to get rid of, bad experiences from last year, and then you kind of throw it into the water and are free, which I think is exactly when you're throwing stones at Satan.
Thank you. And I think the last thing I would say from a Christian point of view is that the common comparison between Isaac and Christ, because they both were the sacrificial victim, needs at least to have alongside it the comparison between Abraham and Christ, because this faith and this willingness to follow God's path, even down a path whose end is not visible at the time, reminds me of the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, just before he's arrested and tried and executed, prays into the darkness, not knowing what will be asked of him, but eventually says, "But your will, not mine, be done." And in that sense, there's something very Abrahamic about Jesus Christ in our tradition. Well, this object has spoken across centuries, 1,600 of them, and brought all kinds of new ideas alive. And we hope that it will produce even more perspectives and ideas amongst those who come and see it here in the Bode Museum. Thank you very much for being conversation partners in this.
Yeah, and how much we learn from each other while, just sharing our stories. That's really wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.